My name is Carl Dancott, and I'm probably the oldest, or at least the longest running EMS employee here, except for maybe Ed Seagrove, who I think interviewed me when I came to the Office of EMS.
I may have participated, yeah.
But that was back in about 1974, and we called it EMS Communications, and I was a assistant chief dash engineering. There were 5 assistant chiefs in the Office of EMS, and I was the assistant chief dash engineering. The other assistant chiefs were transportation, education, trauma, and I'm sure there were some others in there. Field operations, very important component. Field operations. And I was primarily doing communication, which we eventually decided was the information exchanges necessary to support EMS. It wasn't strictly speaking radio type communication. It was everything from public access, including 911 centers and dispatch, and all the ramifications of EMS.
Hey, I'm Sharon Ryan, and I started with the office in 1978, fresh out of college. And my main focus when I started was to take over a lot of the grants administration work, because the Federal EMS Act of '73 had begun to have the impact of funneling lots of money into the states for EMS purposes. And when I tell this story to people that work with me, I always say, this is how old a dinosaur I am. I was working to get defibrillators on the ambulances. So we didn't even have defibrillators on all the ambulances at that point. So the money that was streaming in through our, what we call the categorical grants, 1201, 1202, 1203, all of that over time was allowing us to work with, and that I worked with the health system agencies and the councils of government across the state to build staffs locally in their areas so that they could then decide what they needed as far as transfer agreements, equipment, and so on. And we would take all of the requests throughout the state, put them in one package, and send them to the federal government to tell them what the state needed for the next period of time. But after I was there about 5 or 6 months, we lost our facilities assistant chief. And so I got promoted at that point, because I was so stellar, I'm sure. But, but I got promoted within 5 or 6 months. And then it sort of turned the tide, because I started getting more into what my real background was, which is in hospital administration. And it was just so opportune, because by this time, the trauma system concept was coming into the state through, again, the end of the 1202, 3, 4 funding. And so it was a great transition to go from what I'd been doing to building, helping to build the EMS system, to then starting to build the trauma and hospital system. So for the next many years, the next 28 years total, that was what I focused on, was mostly trauma.
I'm Bob Bailey. I started with the Office of EMS in June of 1974. I started as a regional coordinator for the counties of Rutherford, Cleveland, McDowell, and Polk, which was the part of the state I was living in at the time. Regional coordinators worked with community colleges, did the testing, did the ambulance inspections, at that point in time, trying to get commitment to get people trained to EMTs. From there, I moved into the education component, promoted and sent to Raleigh as the education coordinator. From there, I became the assistant chief in charge of field operations. Then I was the assistant chief in charge of education. Then I became deputy chief, and then I became chief of the agency in 1985. I retired from the agency and from state government in 1999, September, and I was with the agency about 25 years.
I'm Mike Ettinger. I started work with the Office of EMS on January 2nd, 1980. And I came from teaching paramedics at Guilford Technical, at that time it was GTI, Guilford Technical Institute. We had an associate degree paramedic program there, so I came to OEMS from there. I was PA, and I practiced a bit in that. Then I went to teaching paramedics, and I came to EMS. So I came in as the assistant chief education when I came in 1980, and we were just started to roll out something called regional testing at that point, which is a wonderful time was had by all doing that. And I don't want to miss the fact that Gerald Brown knew everything there was to know about EMS, OEMS education when I got there. And between he and Bob, they were able to at least give me some idea of the direction I was supposed to be going in at that position. So that was good. When Bob became the chief, I became the deputy chief then and stayed in that position until I retired. I think it was 2003 was when I finally left the Office of EMS in retirement. So.
Hi, my name's Ed Browning. I started with the office in November 1980 as the educational programs consultant. Prior to the time with the office, I worked at Appalachian State University over several programs, the Emergency Vehicle Operators course, which was funded through the Office of EMS, the mobile EMT lab that was out training people in rural communities, the communications lab that went around in rural sections of the state that was set up in a community for several weeks. The EMT lab produced something similar. So in 1974, my father passed away of a sudden heart attack. And that is really what led me in the interest of EMS. After he passed, I went to grad school and got involved in the EMS program through the Office of EMS. Came in as an educational programs consultant. Mike was my supervisor, and when he moved up in the agency, I became the assistant chief education and then eventually assistant chief for the agency.
I'm the new kid on the block. I didn't come in until 1986, and I was working in state government in personnel administration, and then through some changes, I applied for a job with OEMS, and I did it based on my background in the military. I spent 6.5 years in the Army, and I was basically an ambulance driver. The difference was mine had rotor wings instead of wheels. So, and based on my age also, I was involved in Vietnam. Came to North Carolina and went to work, as I said, in HR first and then field operations with OEMS. And worked just extensively with I think it was 13 program planners or coordinators out in the we had the regional offices and then the planners, as we call them, and of course working hand in glove with ed and education and training to involve the regional coordinators with the services they were providing to the individual units and unifying the services all across the state, developing a level of service that was consistent across the state.
And Universal Studios decided to do a series of pilot programs to air against Archie Bunker and All in the Family. And they came to LA County Fire Department and talked to a gentleman, Chief Jim Page, was the battalion chief in charge of the LA County program. And they wanted to do this depiction of paramedics. And Page told them they could do it, but only as long as it was depicted as real. It couldn't be made up. It could not be just synthetic programs. There had been an earlier rescue program called Rescue 58 or Rescue something. They showed LA County paramedics flying around the world doing rescues, and that was not realistic. So Page said, do it as real, and you can do the paramedic program Emergency on TV. It became quite popular and was aired nationwide, but it made people all over the U.S. think that such programs existed. And now the nation was looking at why don't we have paramedics wherever we are. So I, working for Biocom, became kind of an ambassador. I was sent out to different places. Miami, Florida was one of the early programs, and surprisingly enough, Haywood County, North Carolina, was one of the very earliest paramedic programs to this. And Jim Page, the battalion chief, he was learning some things himself. He was recruited by the state of North Carolina as the first chief of the Office of Emergency Medical Services. And he moved to North Carolina and started EMT programs, trying to train, I use this term qualified, the good old boys to treat patients. And they didn't want to be treated. They didn't want to be trained. They didn't want to learn. The fun of being an emergency responder, of course, is running the siren and the fire engine in the ambulance, not treating patients.
If you're looking at EMS in North Carolina, I think one of the things that set the stage for EMS to be a leader was the 1973 EMS Act. That was probably the most comprehensive EMS Act in the country at the time. That was two-sided, actually, because the law was enacted and it spelled out all these aspects, trauma, communications, ambulances, I mean, the whole 9 yards. And the office itself was just gearing up. Jim Page was chief. People were being staffed as that went along. And as Carl mentioned earlier, Jim Page was dynamic as anyone you'll ever meet, and he was a hard charger. So he hit the ground running, and he was dragging what staff was with him at that time running because we didn't have the systems in place to do what the law said we had to do. We were trying to build those systems, and that created problems. That created political problems for him. It created political problems for the office. The office had its own internal problems. Some of us knew what we was doing. Some of us didn't know what we were doing. Some of us were saying, where did the train go? And we had a state that majority of EMS service was provided by volunteers. And there was a big pushback on that because they were saying, this is too fast. I've already got this. Why can't I be grandfathered in? And remember, North Carolina said your minimum response is an EMT, period. Volunteer or paid, didn't matter. That was a big problem. As a result of that, in early 1975, I think it was, because I moved down in 74, and the next thing I know, Jim Page had been fired. Colonel Charles Speed, that Carl talked about earlier, ex-commander of the Highway Patrol, was brought over. He was brought over to close the office. People were unhappy with us. They were unhappy with what we had done or not done. There was a lot of turmoil, and his job was to shut us down. His contribution to EMS in North Carolina was that he came and sat down and talked with the staff. He wanted to know what we were all about. He did not come from EMS. He came from Highway Patrol, and as Carl and others have said, he knew all the politicians. He was respected by all the politicians. He knew all the people all over the state, and he single-handedly bought into what the state was trying to do to improve patient care in this state. And he gave us time to correct some of our problems. Personally, I think EMS, I think his contribution was he saved the EMS office and bought the time in order for us, to allow us to take the next steps and move forward.
So when I started, we had no trauma centers, right? The only helicopter programs that we had at all were run through MAST, which you guys have worked with. I hadn't even worked with them. Herb Proctor was probably a major entity, Dr. Proctor, in coordinating. So when we needed a patient moved, they pretty much got moved by the military ambulance program system, air ambulance system. So that program was, spotty at best. We had no coordination of trauma problems when we saw them out in the field. We didn't have regional advisory committees and so on. And so none of that existed. So we built the criteria first, hoping that somebody would apply. And fortunately, by 1982, Duke, UNC, and Baptist all applied for level 1 designation. And they were actually the first ones that were designated in the state of North Carolina. But you also have to remember, we didn't have a process for designating either. And you talk about political and a hotbed trying to go out and decide who's going to get designated and who's not. Well, it's great if you designate them, but if you don't designate them, that's you better be able to back that up. And so, and there was no system to draw upon at that point for how you visited and inspected hospitals. The American College of Surgeons now does that. They didn't do that then. They didn't want to get involved with that at that point. So we decided how we were going to inspect and designate hospitals. So you go from there to now we have, I think, 17 maybe trauma centers. We have 6 1s and 4 2s. And most amazingly, we've built on the level 3s, which is really what the state of North Carolina needed when I left. We needed more 3s. We didn't have any data collection. I mean, none. We were collecting data at the individual EMT level, at the paramedic, level at each EMS group, but we weren't even pulling all that data in the state office that was pre-hospital data, let alone hospital data around trauma. So we actually developed through our trauma centers a trauma registry for the state. It ended up being basically the national example that was used by the American College of Surgeons to then later, many years later, build their own system of a trauma registry. So at one point, North Carolina was definitely a leader in a lot of areas across the country. We were probably in the top 5 or 10 of the states in the U.S. as far as trauma, because we did a lot of things when there wasn't any directive on how to do that, right?
Yeah, I'd like to hit on something here that is kind of personal to me in all this. When I worked with Guilford County EMS in the 70s, we lived in an environment, and I loved it. I still tell people that's the best job I ever had was actually being on an ambulance. But anyway, we're in an environment where we got to the door of the hospital, and that was it. We had to check our skills at the door. We had to check our knowledge at the door. We were not a part of what happened on the other side of that door. And as Sharon was talking earlier about the trauma system and how it grew and it built there, I think it was that. I think it was Carl and communication. It was the way the Office of EMS was put together went a long way toward making that different. That whole thing about being stopped at the door. I think the Office of EMS could have ended up being just a state agency that maybe certified people and inspected ambulances, and that was it. And which would have been big. I mean, if you do that on a systematic basis, that's good. But the foresight of the people that went before us, either intentional or serendipity, to put it all together under one roof, began to knock down those barriers for the field folks. And I'm talking from the field perspective, where there was a new level of professionalism because of the certifications, because of the standards of care that began to take place out in the field. And then that professionalism, while there were still isolated incidences of arguing about patients in the ED, that began to break down because of things like Sharon did with trauma centers and Carl did with communications, and because of what these folks did with the field personnel. And it's a great system, but that to me is one of the great things that happened over those years was bringing that together as a system as opposed to being adversarial in some of that.
I came into field operations, and my first part of my job was, I guess, an orientation, just to how the program was set up. And then following that, I realized the importance of the regional office in providing service to the local programs. And in conjunction with that, the regional planners working for the counties. So it had to be a hand-in-hand function between the state office, the regional office, and the regional planners. And as Sharon mentioned earlier, she was involved with grant funds. Well, we were too, in providing grant funds to the regional programs and to the regional planners to expand their quality of service. So, as it's been referenced earlier, everything is being done manually in the field, as far as ambulance inspections, the training, the testing, and we went through several weeks of program writing in Greensboro to set into place a transition from the manual aspect to computerization of the training records, the inspection records. So that was a principal transition going from the analog into the digital aspect of it.
So Bob and Mike, after I got there at the office, wanted me to revamp the EMT exam. It was time to get that done. So based on the competency-based program we had at ASU and Caldwell Community College, I took questions from that comprehensive, probably 1,000 questions, and put together an exam. Put that out, and that did go through review, but put it out and came back in. At that time, the processing exams was about 4 to 6 weeks, depending on what time of year it was. No computerization at all. So anyway, the test results came back, and it was like a 41 to 42% pass rate. So Bob, so Bob and Mike says, we need to talk. Okay. So anyway, we did some revising on the exam and put it through the standardized curve function, and life moved on.
Back in the early 80s, and we were trying to implement things like regional testing and different levels of certifications, et cetera, and we had the volunteers. I mean, there was an adversarial relationship politically between what the office goals were and what some of the folks were perceiving that to be out in the field. And I know we made very intentional decisions that we were going to go anywhere, everywhere, anytime, and listen and meet with people.
I had been in the office since 74, but I became chief in 85. In 85, we were in the throes of trauma. We were in the throes of trying to do communications. We were in the throes of trying to revamp and bring to the level that 73 basically addressed, the law of 73 basically addressed. So you still had the politics, medical politics, pre-hospital politics, county politics, all that was there. But what had changed was that we had come far enough along that most of the people within the state realized that, in general, my ability to get somebody who can help me to a higher level is here now.
When we were putting rules together, you had some mealy-mouth thing where you had to have 1 or 2 public hearings. I hated the years that I had to get on teeny-weeny airlines and fly all over this state from Chapel Hill to go meet with folks, because I hated flying in those little things. Bob Bailey and I were in one time, and I was in the back seat, and he looked back there at me and said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, your magazine's upside down." You know, I mean, I was white knuckle. But that was an intentional effort on our part. We did it to try to say, we're here, we are trying, but we're trying to listen. But we found out that they knew stuff. We found out that they weren't just trying to be hard to get along with. We found out that there were some good ideas that came out of that. And so I don't really know even the problems that you face today. I'm so far removed from it. But I do know just from common sense and just from some of the experiences we have, the more people you involve in ideas, the more people you listen to, number one, that's all they want is to be listened to. But number two, sometimes it's a good idea comes out of it.
Well, there were some funny things going on, a lot of fun. And as you said, Tom, I think there was a lot of camaraderie among the staff people. And yeah, we would pull jokes from time to time, but One of the funny things I recall was we had a supervisor out in our western office, and Buncombe County EMS and Emergency Services Director was Jerry Vihon. So Jerry calls Bob on the phone and says, listen, this supervisor you got out here needs to be fired. And Bob's response was, well, Jerry, I can't fire him just based on what you're telling me. We need more complaints from different people. So about a week later, the actual phone book ended up in Bob's office with a note from Jerry. Bob, everybody in this phone book wants this person fired.
That's true, but let's be honest here. Jerry never liked anything we did. Whatever we did, he was against it.
I remember we had our field staff that was all over the state. They were great fun most of the time. And when I was the deputy chief of the office, I got multiple requests or complaints for like using a credit card to buy shoes with, or your state credit card, or that the state vehicle was noted at places it shouldn't have been, or one thing and another. But my favorite in all that was Ned Wyatt. Ned was a great guy. Ned was a funny guy. Sometimes he didn't mean to be funny, but he was a funny guy. And Ned was really interested in staff meetings. We used to always say that you had to listen to everything Ned said, because every now and then he would say something that made sense, and you had to pick up on it. But Ned sent in the best request I ever had. Ned pulled up to a service station to fill up his state car with gas. It was a commercial service station. It wasn't one of the state service stations. So he pulled up, and when he left, he forgot to take the hose out of his car. And so it pulled it out of the pump. Gasoline flying everywhere. It was a big deal. And so they sent so Ned, they held him responsible for this. So Ned sent to me a request for certain thousands of dollars because that had happened. And I said, Ned, I called him and I said, Ned, how do you think the state office of EMS is responsible for you doing that? He said, because I work for you people, and if I had been working with you people, I'd have never been there to begin with, so you need to pay me for all it. We did not pay that bill, but that was great fun.
When I was operations chief, the first cars the state EMS office had were 1974 Ambassador Ramblers, station wagons. And by the time I was in operations, they were falling apart. We couldn't get them replaced. I mean, windows would fall out, engines would blow, and I kept trying to get them changed, and they wouldn't. They said, no, you got to run them for another 10,000 miles. I said, they won't last that long. I said, well, you got to run them for another 10,000 miles. So I put it in a requisition for 16 or 18. I don't remember how many field cars we had at that point. I put in a requisition for 16 or 18 45 caliber pistols. So I get called into the office and says, well, what is these for? And I said, well, you won't let us replace them, so I was going to put them out of their misery. We didn't get the cars, by the way. We didn't get the pistols either.
But it was always interesting when we got new cars, because, you'd rotate in, 4 or 5 or whatever every year. And the big thing was running down to see who could figure out what was broken in that car, because we always had substandard car. That whole series of station wagons where the windows fell down in the back when like they just dropped down into the car itself, that happened. And then, it was just, I went through 3 alternators in one car in 1 year. I mean, traveling. I mean, there was always something. They never held up on the road.
There used to be a group called the OEMS Dive Team.
Oh, yeah.
And Ed had a trailer down at White Lake, camper. And he invited some of the fellas from the Office of EMS go down and stay in his camper at White Lake. If you don't know White Lake, it's a very large, round lake, probably 8 foot deep at the deepest. But he rented a flat-bottom boat.
Pontoon boat.
a pontoon boat, and he's going to take us out, and we were going to go diving, scuba diving. He and several of the others had taken a class and become certified as divers. So Ed took us out in a boat, and we went putting around. Well, in a round lake, there are hardly any places to go except around. So we went out, and we're putting along, and Ed decided to open. We were trying to pick a place to dive in an 8-foot deep lake. Ed took it out. He opened that thing up. He pushed those balls to the wall, and we were heading out. We were up on a plane, and we were going. And then all of a sudden, he pulled back on it. And the thing stopped, and it nosed into the water. I mean, he turned the thing into a submarine. Of course, all the dive gear was stacked up on the deck of the boat. All of the dive bags, the weights, the tanks, the regulators, everything went over the front. And it stopped, and everything fell in the water. And he turned around and said, well, I guess this is where we're going to go diving. Am I lying?
No, you're telling the truth. And one facet of that, I went to a dive shop to rent some dive equipment, and the guy said, where are you diving? I said, well, White Lake. He said, you want to take a shovel with you?
Without identifying the person, this was when Bob was still chief. And we had an employee that was using the intercom in the council building for general commentary. So Bob called me up to the office and said, Ed, we need to talk to this employee, not to use the intercom. So I went back, talked to this employee, and said, we only need to use the intercom for emergent type situations. Had a conversation with the chief. So I walked back into my office, and I hadn't sat in my chair yet. And this employee says, Bob, this is the person's name. I'll talk on the intercom anytime I want to. And if you don't like it, call Jim Hunt, who was the governor, obviously, at the time. Well, again, I hadn't gotten set in my office chair yet. I went ahead and got up, started back around to Bob's office because I knew I was going to get the call. So anyway, talked to Bob. Anyway, we decided that person needed to be on some disciplinary type leave. So the next day, this employee, Bob's office is in the second floor of the council building. So Bob's in the office, car comes around back and starts laying down on the horn. Bob gets up out of his chair at his desk, looks out the window, and this person says, hello, Bob, it's person name, beeps the horn a couple more times and speeds off. Well,
This is an EMS employee?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So what was funny, the funny part about it was Mike and I were working on a curriculum project. And Carl was an early user of PowerPoint, and we're using the little 3.5 floppy disks. He put together a PowerPoint with this car flying into stopping, horn beeping, beep, 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 and then a caption came across, hello, Bob, this is you know who. Beep, 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 and the car speeds off again. Well, Mike and I, working with Carl, we got the desk and went to Bob's office and said, we'd like to see some of the recommendations we got for this curriculum change. So Bob, unknowing that he puts it in, and Carl had it on auto start. He puts it into the computer, and sure enough, it's boop, boop, boop. Bob kind of looks at it. He did not quite find the same humor that the three of us had.
There are kernels of, there are kernels of truth in what he just told you.
I don't know why we were in Raleigh. I guess it was a staff meeting. I don't remember, but for whatever reason, it was on, I remember it being on a Saturday morning. We was all going to play golf. You remember that?
Yes.
And so Seagrove's wanting to fit in with everybody, I guess, decided he going to go play golf too. So we had anybody wanted to play golf. We were going to this golf course. Well, he didn't tell anybody he'd never played golf before. He didn't tell anybody he didn't have golf clubs. He didn't tell anybody he didn't know anything about the game of golf. But here we go. We go out to the golf course, and the first inkling I had of it is when I went to, everybody was getting their clubs out of the car, and I went and looked at the back of Seagrove's car and raised the tailgate on it, and there were golf clubs spread out all over the car in the back. He had no golf bag. He had no golf shoes. and here he's picking up a bundle of golf clubs, and we're going to go play golf. We found you a golf bag in the trash can. Somebody else had thrown a golf bag away, and we got him, and we played golf that day, didn't we?
We did. I enjoyed it too.
We had one incident that I'll share with Colonel Speed. We talked about Colonel Charles Speed, who was the director, ex-highway patrol. He was an artist in chewing you out. I mean, if you got chewed out by him, you knew you had been chewed out. So you didn't want to get chewed out by him. Well, you heard earlier we had early on the emergency vehicle operation courses, EVOC, and at that point, all the tires were supposed to come to the warehouse, and we had to go manually load them on trucks and take them to where they were. This time they came to the office, and Steve Asai, who was transportation, wasn't there at that point, so the rest of us in the office unloaded the truck, took him up to the fourth floor, and filled his office full of EVOC tires to the point the door wouldn't shut. So it was off the hinges, laying against the tires, and we were all hid, waiting for him to come in that morning. We wanted to see the reaction. Well, around the corner comes Colonel Speed, and he's walking to Steve Asai's office. I guess he had a meeting with him or something, and we said, "Uh-oh, this does not bear well." And he walked to the door. He grabbed the door, and he started to pull it open. The door fell back. He pushed it back in place and looked around the door, saw all those tires, and he always carried his glasses in his hand like this, and he turned around, looked both ways, touched the door one more time. He turned around, walked back to his office. He never said a word about it. And the rest of us were breaking up. Well, it started off as a concept of trying to do an educational program for the EMS providers, EMTs across the state, trying to bring everybody together to have, I think the first time, I think we were basically talking about training programs and pre-hospital and hospital or something like that. But it's about 2 tracks. I don't remember exactly what they were, but 2 or 3 tracks was all they had. We wanted to do that because it gave, number one, an opportunity for them to go get some continuing education or some training without pagers going off and being called out. In other words, if they were able to come to the program, they were able to participate in the program. And the second factor was that it gave them an opportunity to have some social interaction and meet with other EMS people across the state, again, without the pagers going off and being drawn out. First one I remember, I think, had about 150, 175 people attended. And the educational portion of that was really well attended. And the social portion was really, really, really well attended. And they seemed to really, really, really enjoy themselves. And I usually headed to the room early at night because they were really enjoying themselves. By the time I left, by the time I retired from the state, I think at that point we were up to right out of probably 1,000 people. And we had gone to the Winston-Salem place by then because we couldn't hold it anywhere else. We started doing it across the state. We'd hold it east, central, and west, but it got so large that was about the only place that could handle it at that point in time. It evolved to multiple tracks. All of that, and I wasn't being facetious backstage, primarily that was because of the efforts of Mike and Ed. They this was not really part of their job to begin with, but they spent 6 months out of the year working on it one way or another. Of course, it gave them a chance to get out of the office too every once in a while and go to Winston-Salem, but we won't go there. But in fact, they were responsible for building it to what it became, at least before I left, and it seems to continue to be growing. The baseline was there because, as you told me earlier, we're up to 1,500 people now on 8 tracks. That's awesome.
I've got to say something. If Browning and I are going to get credit for emergency medicine today, I got to tell you about when we almost had our careers cut really, really short because of emergency medicine today. Harmony was going to fire both of us. We went to Asheville one year for emergency medicine today at the Inn on the Plaza. You remember? And by that time, Tom Harmelink, our chief, had made the fatal error of learning to trust us to do this and to do it like he would want it done. And we generally did with it for most part of it, but the social part of it was the big deal. That's what everybody came for. And so since we were in Asheville and since we were familiar with Bill Stanley's Barbecue and Bluegrass that was right underneath the City Hall there in Asheville at the time, and we were familiar with the Mark Pruitt Bluegrass Band, that was going to be our entertainment. We had barbecue for our dinner, and we had a live bluegrass band and cloggers for the entertainment. And people were having a big old time, except for Mr. Harmelink. He didn't know that was coming until the programs had come out and all that kind of stuff, you know, and he was not a happy camper. You remember that? He explained to us that would never happen again at emergency medicine today, and the chances were good that we wouldn't be around for more emergency medicine today after that. But no, it was a good meeting, and it's right. It's grown, and it's a good time. It really does have a lot of serious things going on to it. It's a good educational time, but it's a good time to blow off some steam too, I think. So we almost got fired over it.
Stories, the high point of the first EM Today was held at the Governor's Inn in Chapel Hill or Raleigh, wherever that is, Research Triangle. And it was a smaller affair, but the high point of that meeting was the 3-legged sack race in the parking lot at the end of the meeting,
Oh, my.
headed up by the chief.
The thing I get out of the EM Today is chance for the paramedic competition and get all the teams to just really strut their stuff after what they are capable of doing. And that impressed me every year. And the pleasure they got out of doing a competition. They took it seriously. Yeah.
Back to the Winston-Salem, and Mike will know, we had several at the Curry Center in Greensboro, and either Mike or myself would be the point of contact if the social got a little bit out of hand. So I think one of the things I remember from the Winston-Salem meeting that Bob alluded to, we used the convention center and 2 hotels connected to the convention center. Well, security got a complaint about a room being a little bit loud. And as it turned out, that room had several OEMS employees in it. So the next day, I won't call out a name, Bob saw this employee with sunglasses on like at 9 o'clock in the morning. Basically to cover up his eyes. But anyway, credit to the office for continue to make that one of the outstanding educational conferences in the nation. North Carolina has received more than $125 million for the hospital preparedness program grant. And a lot of that has now been funneled to our healthcare coalitions. Started off with 8 healthcare coalitions and now have this coming year 6. A couple of them have been combined for administrative and operational advantages. So I'd like to, again, credit the staff, the whole office staff, and the HBP component of that staff for the leadership in preparing for a much more resilient response capabilities and planning. And I think that was most probably evident most recently in response to Helene in North Carolina. I know a lot of agency staff spent hours upon hours upon hours at night, 24/7 in that response. And I think the other thing, and I'll quit, is it was so much more a statewide effort, not just the Office of EMS, but all of our partners in that response.
You know, I don't know how some people do their jobs and get out of it what we have the opportunity to get out of our jobs and our careers. I know personally when I leave this earth, it's a better place knowing that we were involved with EMS, with trauma. I know patients have been saved that would have never been saved for years and into the future probably from work that we did in the pre-hospital and the hospital venues. I mean, how much more could you ask out of giving yourself some sense of worth and identity for what you've done as a career?
But to look at the evolution of the system and know that our agency acted as a focal point for everything from 911 systems and ambulance hospital communication and trauma centers and aeromedical evacuation, that of all of the states, North Carolina was usually a leader.
Thing I take pride in is knowing that when a unit rose up on an event or a call, that they're going to get quality service, and it's going to be statewide. So I think the level of care, level of service that the program has provided and continues to provide, it gives the general population confidence that when they call, they're going to get good care.
What you would say to future EMS professionals or those that are currently EMS professionals? Number one, remember why you decided to choose that as a career. What reasons led you to choose that as a career? Secondly, every day is not going to be a perfect day for you. And then finally, take home the impact that you've had on several people's lives through what you have done as an EMS provider.
I love all these people on this stage and all the other folks that I worked with at the Office of EMS. I have never, for one day in my life, ever been ashamed to say that I work for the North Carolina Office of Emergency Medical Services. And I wouldn't necessarily say that about all the state government, but certainly our agent, because to a person, my experience with this has been that at the end of the day, with all the craziness that went on, with all the arguing that went on, with everything else that went on, we had the best interest of the people of North Carolina at heart, trying to do everything we could do to assure that they received the level of pre-hospital care and in-hospital care that they deserved and that we were being paid to do. So it was a wonderful experience for me, and I'm sure if we looked at the staff today, they'd say the same thing, because this is an outstanding organization from the time it started to the time it is today, I'm sure. So thank you for letting us come talk about this.